The RTÉ Rugby Podcast, sponsored by Canterbury. See the new Irish men and women's rugby jerseys at canterbury.com.
And you are very welcome along to this week's RTÉ Rugby Podcast on URC final week. No Irish team in it for the first time since 2007. It's going to be the Stormers against the Bulls this Saturday in Cape Town. That's live on RTÉ2 and RTÉ Player. But also the Irish squad for this summer's 3 test series against New Zealand and those 2 games against the Maori as well was announced yesterday by Andy Farrell. A 40-man squad, and here to talk about it, we have Eddie O'Sullivan. Eddie, how are you today?
Great, thanks.
And we also have Fiona Hayes, who I believe is so angry about Jack Odonnell not making that she hasn't even gone to bed since yesterday. That's true, Fiona?
That's exactly true, Neil. You're on the money there, on the money.
All right. Well, look, we'll get straight into the Irish squad. It's a 40-man group, 5 uncapped players in it. Jimmy O'Brien, Kieran Frawley, Joe McCarthy from Leinster, Jeremy Loughman from Munster, and Cian Prendergast from Connacht. Before we get the thoughts of Fiona and Eddie, we'll hear from Ireland head coach Andy Farrell. I was speaking to him yesterday.
So I suppose just to get started, I might just get your immediate thoughts. 40-man squad, I imagine it was tough to nail it down in the end, I would say. And are you just pleased, I suppose, with the balance across the 40 you have?
Oh yeah, no, we're delighted. We're so excited about taking this squad as a group of 40 to probably the hardest place in world rugby to go to, and finding out about ourselves. This is a historic tour that probably will never be done again, certainly with how we've structured the tour. Maybe Ireland will never get to play a 3-game test series out there again, and this is the ultimate, isn't it? We're talking about building now towards a World Cup, and what you want to do in those type of circumstances is test yourself against the best, and it doesn't get any better or tougher than going to New Zealand and playing them in their own backyard with what we see as 5 test matches.
And just finally for me then, have you spoken to any of the players who just missed the cut, or will you be speaking to any of those players? And how hard was it, I suppose, then to just nail down those last few places?
Yeah, no, there's plenty of conversations that have been happening over the last few days, and like always, it's tough, because they all wanted to make the tour. It was all, I'm 100% sure, within their goals of the season to perform well enough to get on this tour, because they can see what it means to Irish rugby, and they want to be part of it. We've picked out a 40-man squad, which is the biggest squad that we've picked because of the schedule, etc. And they know the players that have missed out, and the injured players, and the guys who have been picked as well, that this is the opportunity to show what they're about under most extreme pressure, to see whether they can perform at the highest level, and see whether they earn the right to carry on into next year, which is obviously the World Cup year.
Eddie, I'll come to you first off the back of the Irish squad. We'll get obviously to the players who were left out, because I think it just inevitably happens, and I'm sure you know that all too well from your time coaching Ireland, that when you name a squad that you think is absolutely fantastic, it's the one thing people want to talk about is the players who aren't in it. But we'll talk about the players who are in it first of all. What do you make of it? What are the inclusions in there? Not even just the uncapped guys. What are the inclusions in there you like? What is it about the squad you like? The balance of it overall?
Yeah, I think, well, there's things to like about it and things to worry about. Things I like about it is, I suppose, there's a bit of stability there. The guys you'd expect to get in are in. There's no major shocks in the frontliners. There's nobody, like the guys that are not there, that should have been probably there, were basically injured. So Carty's out, Balakoon, Keller would have had a say if he was fit, Andrew Conway if he was fit. So they're out, so that's because they're injured. So the one thing I probably was a little concerned about is the numbers. He's got 40 players going. That's a lot of players on a tour, don't get me wrong. But he's got 5 games, and effectively, in the space of 3 weeks or 3.5 weeks. The logistics of that are very tricky, because if you think about a game where you're playing the Maoris on a Wednesday and you have a test on a Saturday, like you're trying to get ready 2 teams in the same week for 2 games, which is very unusual. You don't do that anymore as a test coach. Usually if you're playing on a weekend, you're spent the whole week getting ready for that. And you see guys are going to double up in terms of covering the bench. And So I think that's the logistics around it. No, it's not that it can't be done, but it makes life very tricky and very difficult, But okay, that's the lie of the land, and I kind of knew that. But I just a little bit worried that if they're unlucky with injuries, they might be shy very quickly. I know they're okay probably going out, but once you get 2 or 3 games into the tour, if they get injuries in certain quarters, it could be quite skinny. And the guys he's brought he's got some new faces, which is always great on a tour, but they're very inexperienced, So there's a risk in that for him. I know he's calculated that risk, but I think 40 players is. I would have been happier in terms of giving himself more cover if he had another 2 or 3 guys on the play. And I know it's a lot, but when you think you have to suit up 23 players for each game, and the front row cover, they've got 6 props, which is effectively very little cover. Because you've got specialists, you've got 3 tight heads. So if a tight head gets injured, you're down to 2 tight heads straight away. So things like that, and the same with the hookers. 3 hookers, 1 hooker gets a knock. It could be a dead leg, for a week with a dead leg, and you're down. And then you've the problem then is, do I try and get a guy out, or is your man going to be ready? So I think he's given himself the combination of having 2 games in a week is a challenge, and then he's a little bit short numbers. Now, if he doesn't get injuries, I think he could be okay. But I think he's putting us under pressure there, and I think he could have brought more. But anyway, that's my thought. But I think all the guys that are in, you'd expect them in, and the guys who missed out, in terms of the injuries, some of them would have certainly been in. I think Ballycoon would have been in, for sure. I think probably Jack Carty has missed the tour because of the hand injury. But look, there's no real shocks there, except when you get into the nitty gritty. And I think he's brought a couple of capped players there, or uncapped players, sorry, that, probably a more experienced guy you might have expected on the plane. But and I know we're going to get into the guys who are left out, but I wouldn't have too many, as I say, I wouldn't be baking about that too much. But I'm sure Fiona has a few bakes there. But I think, there's one particular one I would look at. No, I thought McCluskey should have made the tour.
Yeah, and obviously, we were talking about him last week. I was going to get up because you were obviously so effusive in your praise of him. It was clear you're a big fan of him. Is this obviously is Kieran Frawley being there? Is if it's a 42-man squad or if it's a 41-man squad, is he inclined to maybe bring that extra body? Whereas if it's a 40-man squad, is Kieran Frawley there to cover? He's covering centre. He can go in and out half if needed. Andy Farrell mentioned yesterday that he spent part of the game against the Bulls playing at full back. So Stuart McCluskey is more your out and out number 12.
Yeah, no, just there's 2 ways to look at it. One is I thought McCluskey again was outstanding last weekend for Ulster. He was again a huge catalyst in the game. So the guy, there's no argument that the guy is right up there. He's right in the firing line in terms of getting on the tour. I think that's fine. I take his point on board. I do take his point on board about bringing someone like we said Frawley who can play across the line. But Frawley is uncapped. If you're bringing a guy who can play across the line, it's much safer if he's experienced. But let's say Frawley has to go into a test game now in any position, whether it's out half, full back, or centre. If the chips fall that way in the last week of the tour, and you've got Frawley's your utility guy, and you've got to put him in there because he's the last man standing kind of thing. You put an uncapped player maybe into a test game, so that's the risk in it. And I understand why you brought Frawley. I think Frawley's been outstanding, and probably Frawley's problem going forward in his career is what's he want to be. Does he want to be a 10? Does he want to be a 12? Or does he want to be a full back? But that's probably early days stuff. But he probably has decisions to make soon. But yeah, I understand why you brought him. But I feel bad for McCluskey that he's where he is and he doesn't get the nod. And that's why I'm thinking maybe if he took a couple of more guys, fellas like McCluskey might have got in. But anyway, look, we're all in semantics here. You don't know. But I understand why you brought Frawley, for sure. Jimmy O'Brien is another one, and I can see that again. But you can argue the case at the end of the day that Joey Carberry can play full back as well. Mm-hmm. Jordan Larimer has history at full back, so Jimmy O'Brien might be a bit of a luxury there. And again, he's uncapped. He's been good for Leinster. But they're all up for debate. But I'm not saying they're wrong decisions because it's very easy to be playing Monday morning quarterback about things, and it's easy to be making out these decisions. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Because I've been in there myself, and he's a reason for doing it, but they're just tossed across your mind when you put uncapped players in those positions going on tour. I think he wants to use his uncapped players in the Maori games, for sure, give him experience, but you don't want to be throwing him into a test game in New Zealand for their first cap. That's a hell of a leap for them, But anyway, look, that's my diatribe on it, I'm sure Fiona's got something else to say.
Yeah, and Fiona, like I know I was joking at the start, obviously, because Jack Odonnell, who is probably one of the main players people had spoken about in the last few months as being someone who should be involved in the squad. But like Eddie was making the good point, when you want to say, player X should get in, whether it's Stuart McCluskey or it's Jack Odonnell or Ross Maloney, it's hard to look at the squad and say who shouldn't be in there out of, that list of back rows or that list of centres.
Yeah, no, that's spot on, Neil, because that's the question people follow up with. Who'd you take off with? So,
and then you're sitting there silent, not really prepared to throw anyone under the bus.
Yeah, well, that's it. And look, everyone, to be fair, deserves their spot. There's been some great performance. We've talked about Frawley. These guys have put their hand up playing week in, week out. But I suppose with that Jack Odonnell point, it's like, what more does he have to do? He's just won Munster Player of the Season. I thought he's been outstanding. I personally think him, and it's not his fault, getting injured for the last 2 games came at a disadvantage to him, because you're kind of out of sight, out of mind. And if he'd put in, even if Munster had lost, but he'd put in a massive shift against Ulster in that game, I think he'd have to be in it more so in Andy Farrell's thoughts. I agree 100% with Eddie. When I saw it, I was wondering, could we not have brought a couple more? You're going across the world, you've hookers in there, you get one of them is injured, then you've 2 guys playing. If he's injured the first game, you'll obviously fly someone out, but you've 2 guys that have been training and know the systems that are going in, that will have to play all the games then from them, although you might bring someone out. So it's just, there could have been scope for a couple more players, especially with those 5 games. That's the way I'm feeling. But with the players in there, you've Baird, he's an outstanding player. We know what he can offer. He's down as a back row. I'd love to have seen him in the second rows and maybe get Jack there in the back row. But look, it's a good squad. Props is another area Eddie spoke about, and I think we'll get to see a lot of these guys. They haven't performed maybe outstandingly well scrum wise towards the latter end of the season. And I know going with their provinces, and I know going into this Ireland tour, they'll get a chance to fix that. Obviously it's not the same power as that South African front row or sometimes that English pack that you play against, but I think it's good for these guys to go over, and Lockman especially, it'll be really good to see him, maybe if it's only in the Maori games, but it'd be good to see him get game time under his belt at that international level. But there's definitely a scope for a few players to chat about not being on the plane, but everyone loves to talk about that, don't they?
Yeah, and feel like of the 5 uncapped guys who are there, do you see any of them getting game time in any of the 3 test matches, or do you think that they're going to be playing the bulk of their rugby in those 2 games against the Maori? But is there any of that 5 between Jimmy O'Brien, Frawley, Joe McCarthy, Lockman, Kieran Prendergast, anyone there that you think could actually be on the field in one of those 3 tests against the All Blacks?
I actually think if depending on injury, if there was a slight injury, I think Hume would be one of the first players into the centre. I think personally, on the way he's playing, his footwork, I think Farrell's a big fan of him. So on who's there now, injury free, probably not these guys, but you might get him on the bench. I think Prendergast, it all depends on how they travel over, how they're training over. Farrell is open to giving guys definitely a shot. Maybe not in that first test, but as it goes on, you might see these guys getting their starting spot or even jumping onto the bench and coming on fairly new into the second half.
Eddie, on just the nature of like touring New Zealand, Andy Farrell mentioned yesterday that it's basically it's the toughest place, it's the most iconic place to go on a tour. You obviously had a couple. I was looking back this morning. You'd a couple of New Zealand and Australia tours in there. You didn't quite get like the full 3 test experience that they have now, but you had a couple of there, 2002 and 2006, where you had multiple games down in New Zealand. And it's funny, like you're talking about the squad size. I was looking at yours. You'd 27 in 2002 and 29 in 2006. You're adding another 11 in on top of this now, yeah. And we're talking about how it mightn't even be enough.
Well, I remember the Leinster 2005, the famous Leinster that didn't go particularly well.
Yeah.
Clive Woodward picked 44 players for that tour. Now, that was a full-on tour. It was Wednesday, Saturday. There was 3 tests. There was a Maori's. Like, it was a full-on old-school tour. He picked 44, and there was pandemonium over it. How you bring 44 people? So how the game has changed. And again, like, trying to get 30 guys on tour that time, there was always problems. Because the actual logistics are, and I'm presuming it's still the same as when you tour a country, the host country pays the bills for when you're in country. They pay your accommodation, your meals, your travel, all that. So the more players you bring, the more it costs. Now, there's been debates and there's been, I suppose, negotiations on that over the years. But back then, if you wanted extra players on the tour, it was always costing the RFU. So you're always getting squeezed on the numbers you could bring. And like, you think about it now, going down to New Zealand with 20 odd players, like, it was a fairly high risk strategy. And we nearly won in Dunedin, a famous night in Dunedin, when the famous lemon ball that was kicked around and Rog couldn't get his foot around it. And we lost that game by a whisker. And then 2006, we had a particularly good tour. We were really good shape in Hamilton, and we lost the game in the last 10 minutes. Kind of our discipline let us down the second half, and the same with another good barn burner in Auckland. So we were close enough a couple of times. But the thing about a tour in New Zealand is that you're probably our best chance for test win is your first test, because they are coming out fresh, and they tend to get better as the series goes on. And the only thing I said, they're under a bit of pressure as well in New Zealand. Like, if you listen to the kind of the cockpit chatter in New Zealand around the game, is the general feeling is, as a team, they have kind of plateaued. They haven't been evolving their game. And I suppose the shellacking they got in Aviva Stadium last November certainly hasn't reassured anyone in New Zealand that they're World Cup material in their view. So I think it's the coaching staff more than that. There's not much pressure on the players in terms of that. There's, that he could make a massive number of changes in the squad, but I think the pressure's on the coaching staff to get a really comprehensive win over Ireland in the test series. I still back us maybe take a test, probably the first one if it's going to be one. But if we were to win the series, even, if we won 2 of the 3 tests, there'd be absolute carnage in New Zealand after that, because they're under pressure in terms of where they are in the world pecking order now. They feel a little bit vulnerable, and we are, after all, less than 18 months of a World Cup. So I think they're going to come out swinging. You'd be
very wary of a wounded New Zealand, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and the form is at this. They pretty much still, despite everything, have dominated the Super Rugby series as well. So, like, they're not in a bad place, but the point is the pressure's on them from the New Zealand public, who demand a lot. And I think the New Zealand public feel that this team needs to move forward in terms of their evolution as a team, and that's putting pressure on them. So there'll be no, and of course they're still smarting from November. Let's not forget about that. Like, they got a good spanking. Like, in November was probably, like, we've beaten them a couple times now, but that was a very comprehensive victory over them. There was no if, buts, or maybes. We just beat them well on the day, and they had no complaints. There was no if this, if that. So I think they'll come out swinging, and I think there's going to be like pretty much a New Zealand storm coming at us. So I think we're ready for it. If everyone's healthy and we can bring our form from the Six Nations, we'll be fine. But it's going to be a tough one.
Yeah, and with that as well, Eddie, watching Super Rugby, I mean, I know he's an exceptional player, but Bowden Barrett is in the form of his life as well. He's playing outstanding rugby at the minute. You've Caleb Clark, another guy who's playing really well. So I think players that weren't in form before are starting to come into a bit of form. Obviously, they've played their Super Rugby, and you've 2 New Zealand teams in the final, but you definitely be wary of that's if they play Bowden at 10, but you definitely be wary of him at the minute.
That's the big debate, Fiona, isn't it? Whether they play Barrett at 10 or Richie Mo'unga. They're not even sure themselves. Now, for us, we're pretty clear who our 10 is. Just Johnny Sexton. Yeah, which is an interesting one, because, like, here we are 18 months over World Cup, and we have Johnny again. As they say in America, here comes Johnny. But the thing is, like, the worrying thing there as well for us, if we're just talking about the kind of chinks maybe in where Farrell is looking at down the track, is Johnny Sexton is our 10. But in fairness, I just think that Joey Carberry's lost his mojo a bit for whatever reason, between injuries and maybe Munster's form has been patchy. And then, Jack Carty's injured. Harry Byrne is up next to, again, he seems to have kind of plateaued in terms of his form. So there isn't really a nailed on backup for Johnny. Like Carberry was the man, but and I've no doubt he's capable. You'd love to see him playing more to his form. And then there's the full back position, Hugh Keenan, fine. Lowry has one cap, he's picked up an injury. And now you're looking at Jimmy O'Brien as the backup, those two key positions are still a worry. I'd say they're the two positions maybe keeping Farrell awake at night if he's losing any sleep over, because they're key positions and there's really not much depth there, or proven depth. Well, I suppose you could argue Joy is proven depth, Joy Carberry, but his form is off. So they're two areas watch. See what he'll do. I suspect for sure he's going to have to give Joy a start against the Maoris minimum. That's going to be the first game. And if he gets his form back, great. But if he's struggling, then happens to Johnny, gets a knock and a test, or Joy has to come off the bench after 10 or 15 minutes. Now there you've got problems to solve. So they're the kind of things to be watching for the long term. Is where are we with 10 and 15? I think they're the things he's probably worried most about.
And with that, Eddie, do you think there would have been a case to have Zebo in the squad just, for that cover? Because obviously we saw, I'm not saying, but Jimmy O'Brien probably didn't have his best game at fullback at the weekend. And, and we saw Keenan is a huge loss. And I suppose someone like Zebo's been around the block, he's been capped. But I know that's that question again.
Again, in terms of cover, you're right. That's a good point, because Zebo would cover wing, no problem, and fullback. He's got that pedigree if he can play in the back three, anywhere in the back three. And his form's been very good for Munster. He scored a bundle of tries. So you'd have thought that, if you're traveling that far from home and you could be going down the depth chart, again, there's a case for him being a guy you could bank on in a tight spot. Like if you're going into the last test of the tour and you've got walking wounded all over the place. And the other thing is you have to remember about a tour like this. This is our end of season tour, and the end of season part's important, because a lot of these guys are fit and healthy, but they're all probably carrying knocks and bumps and bruises, and they're all fatigued. There's a bit of fatigue there as well. No, we're better than most countries when it comes to that because we manage our players so well, but there's still an element of fatigue. It's a long season. So guys can break down and there's that kind of get those energy levels up. Whereas if you're comparing this like to going to a World Cup with a squad of players, going to a World Cup, everyone's fresh. Everyone's ready to go. It's a different kind of mindset. But you're in the season stuff here, and that's why we as well feel when New Zealand or Australia or South Africa come up here in November, that's their end of season tour, and they're probably feeling a bit fatigued. So there's going to be the fatigue factor as well, I think, in this, particularly when you've, let's say, 5 games in 3.5 weeks.
And Fee, like with expectation levels or confidence levels for yourself, would they have dropped at all in the last few weeks when you see how Leinster seasons petered out, or how Ulster and Munster seasons eventually just didn't really hit the heights that we thought they were going to maybe 2 months ago?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that's happened to me. I was looking at the start, I was like thinking we could really go out and cause an upset over New Zealand.
3-0 win.
Whitewash, exactly. Just on the form of the players, but it's looking at especially the Leinster team in the last few weeks. Just they look tired. Munster, their last game, they look tired. Now I know Andy Farrell came out and said himself, it's a different system. You can't be looking at the provinces games, but you can look at the players and how their form came into play. And how they looked on the pitch. They do have a bit of time before the game, but I certainly wouldn't be as confident. But look, it's a chance to go to New Zealand. There's guys, they know there's a World Cup coming up. They'll have a few days rest, a few weeks rest, where they'll get the body sorted, hopefully. And then we'll probably see them going back out and going hammer for tongs. Whether it can last for the 3 games is the other question. So I think I'd agree with Eddie on that first game. It's going to be probably the one that they would definitely have a chance of winning.
Ironically, some guys might have too much rest. Like, I'm looking one name there jumps out at me is Bundy Aki. Like, Bundy Aki won't have played for 2 months before the first test. He didn't even play Connacht's last game in Galway against Zebra. So for some reason, I think he picked up a knock the previous week, but he's had a long time. Some guys, like the probably the upside for some guys is they're not getting on the plane after a final, even though we'd all like to be in the final. There's a bit of a break there. But some fellas have been kind of twiddling their thumbs for a few weeks, and that's not good either, because like you lose your sharpness. So like there has to be one name that jumps out. He has to start against the Maoris. Has to start for sure. And then you'll know Mac Hansen hasn't played a lot either. You know, like the Connacht guys have been out of the loop for a while. You know, so yeah. But look, that's all by the by. I think they're in a good place, but. And I would agree. I agree that there's an element of Fiona's element where the guys form are coming in after they've had a couple of setbacks with the province. But the other side of it, I think, is they're very good at. I've noticed this anyway when I was coaching the Irish team that they could leave the province behind and draw a line. It's a different hat. They play on a different hat when they go with Ireland.
So that the results and the mood around the provinces wouldn't really dictate what the first couple of days were like in your camp.
Yeah, well, fellas probably would be a bit down, and in a sense, like I remember Munster used to come in off some of those terrible defeats they had, like maybe in Europe, you know, that
those end of season ones or the big
That, but the funny thing is, I've always found professional players, is that they have this capacity to compartmentalize that stuff, and then they pivot away, and this is the next challenge, and it's a green jersey, not a red jersey or a blue jersey, you know, whatever, and I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. And I think change of scenery as well. You're on a plane, you're in a different country. There's a freshness about it. For me, the thing is, like, we shouldn't be too bad because of our player management system, but it is the end of the season. And I would say none of those guys are 100% fit. And I don't mean that as anyone being put on the plane who's injured. It's just that they're all carrying bumps and bruises. And there's mental fatigue as well of long season. You know, even when you're not playing for your province on the weekend, you're training all the week. You know, most of the miles you put up in a rugby season are actually on the training field. You know, like, so you think about it. So there's a lot of miles on the clock at the end of the season. So the fatigue factor is there. But look, I think if they're lucky with injuries, and they keep, there's no major crises in any particular department, and they bring the form they've had in the spring and last autumn, when they get to New Zealand, I think I really believe they can win at least one test. I think it's there from, but that's, I think that's, they all know that, so that's their mindset going out there. That'll be, I think he's going to get off to a good start. Like, the fellas are going to be on the plane, they're going to be thinking, yeah, let's go here and win a test. Like, we've never won in New Zealand. We've never won a test in New Zealand.
Consider, as you literally just said, considering we've never won a game in New Zealand, you're trying to quantify what is a successful tour. And obviously you want to win a test series. But for example, if Ireland were to lose a test series 2-1, they get one victory in the test, and two respectable enough defeats, and no hammerings or anything like that, and get some nice minutes into the legs for the inexperienced guys in those Maori games and get a couple of decent results. Would that quantify a pretty decent return a year out from a World Cup?
I think it'd be excellent. Look at that. It's superb, I mean, I'm trying to think when's the last time New Zealand lost a test series to anybody in New Zealand, including the Lions, Like, they drew the last Lions series, and that was very controversial. But like, it's a very, very difficult place to get a result. Now, the one thing in our favour, and this has been a kind of a change, I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but I remember looking up before, is one of the reasons we're now like able to match New Zealand and take them toe to toe and maybe beat them on a day. Apart from the fact we've got a very good squad of players at the moment, that's a major factor. But we play New Zealand a lot more often. If we forget that. Like, I remember looking back before 2000, I think we played New Zealand like a handful of times in the previous 100 years. We've nearly played them more in the last 20 years than we played in the previous 100.
I can tell you now, actually, I had it in front of me here. Up until 2000, Ireland had played New Zealand 14 times, and they've played them 22 times since.
There you go. So they
played them 19. By the end of this summer, they'll have played them 22 times.
But I mean, 19 is against what? What was the first statistic?
14.
So we played them more in the last 20 years than we played in the previous 100. So if you think about it, Australia play New Zealand 2 or 3 times a year. So now they don't beat New Zealand that often, and they do enjoy beating them. But they don't see it as a major milestone in the history of their Australian rugby to beat New Zealand. Why? Because they play them so often. So the more you play these teams, the better chance you have of, because I wouldn't have said we played them 19 times. I would have said about 14 or 15. But I was thinking it was fairly even. The last 20 years, the previous 120. Like that's a factor for sure. So like it is common. Like we all thought, when are we going to beat New Zealand for the first time? We got it done in Chicago. We've done it in Dublin. You know, now the next step is, can we do it in New Zealand? You know, and it's definitely possible if things go our way here in terms of injuries and form, and we have a good day out. I think we'll take a test. But if we were to win the series down there, it'd be a phenomenal achievement. Like, because New Zealand don't lose test series at home. You know, the closest they came was the Lions draw.
If Ireland were to win a test series, are you in the back of your head having that little, oh God, are we peaking too early all over again?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. New Zealand did it for years. Like, if you think of New Zealand, were on fire 2 years out from every World Cup. After they were on fire 2 years out for the 91 World Cup, the 95 World Cup, the 99 World Cup. They were on fire 2 years out, and then they got caught in the World Cup. You know, that's the irony of it. Yeah, I remember when they beat us in 2005 in Dublin, they had just butchered the Lions in 05. Then they destroyed Wales in Cardiff. Then they made, I think, 14 changes and destroyed us in Dublin. You know, and that was and then the 07 World Cup, they were knocked out, you know, in Cardiff by France. You know, so yeah, they know that tune pretty well. You know, but look, if we were to win a Test series, I'd take it and say let's make sure we're not peaking too 18 months out.
Well, while we're on the topic of peaking too early, what happened Leinster on Friday night against the Bulls?
Oh gosh, you could go into a lot of different things. You know, people
was
about.
Was there an element of complacency in it? If you look at the team selection, you're talking about a semi-final. Johnny Sexton, I know he's coming back from injury, but you've Johnny Sexton, the Irish captain, you're putting him on the bench. You've Hugo Keenan, who again I know is coming back from injury, but he's the first choice Irish fullback, and you have him as a travelling reserve on the day. Like, is there an element of complacency? Is there a little bit of truth in that?
No, I don't think so. I think he backed you've seen with Leo, you know, he's used these 60 players. You've seen these guys have used them throughout the URC for the whole season. So I think he backed the players that had played previously well, and they had played well. I know you can't take anything from that Glasgow game. You know, it was an absolute hammering, but I wouldn't say complacency is the word. I personally would have liked to, if he was fully fit, I would have liked to see Hugo Keenan on the bench, because he could have come on. You saw Jim O'Brien was struggling a little bit at times. You know, he's played more at wing. That's probably the reason behind that. And he would have came on and added a bit more composure back there, and probably added a lot more in attack as well. But look, I think in general, you're talking about this Leinster squad. I don't know if it was complacent, but they just didn't look themselves. They looked tired. I wouldn't even say it was the big South African power game. I just thought the errors that Leinster had were absolutely crazy. You had the likes of Caelan Doris gave away 5 penalties. I mean, that's unheard of him. You know, there was just everything seemed to go against them. And they didn't have it in their armour, because when it comes to these tight games and into the last few minutes, they seem to be losing these games. They don't seem to have it in their armour. That's a question they'll have to go back and look at. Is it because they're not being challenged really throughout the season, and when it comes to the end of the season, they don't know how to cope with that? But we saw Johnny come on. I mean, I think, you know, we saw him come on in the second half, and he added a bit something. If he'd started, maybe it might have been a different ball game. But look, we knew, you know, with this Bulls team, I mean, some of the stats when I looked at the game, I was looking at it afterwards, trying to figure out what areas Leinster seemed to be dominant in. All areas. They had more meters around, they had everything. But I just thought it was interesting. One of the stats that jumped out at me was passes that Byrne and Sexton had together, 26 passes, and Chris Smith and Mornay Stain, when he came on for the last 7 minutes throughout the whole game, had 3 passes. So it shows you exactly what they kept it narrow. The Bulls, they used their pack well, and I suppose Leinster have to go back to the drawing board and see, can they change their game plan mid-game and cope with that?
Is there something in that, Eddie, that the Leinster, that they're not too familiar being in these close games, and it is where they seem to struggle? Like, I ran the numbers on it earlier in the week. I think they'd 7 or 8 games this season that were 1-score matches. And I think they lost all but 2 of those.
I go back to the Johnny Sexton selection or non-selection. I think that was a big mistake. I think they should have put him on the field. I don't want to say they were complacent. I think they maybe underestimated what was coming down the pike.
I think that was along the lines of what Leo Cullen was saying as well. He actually, without even being asked, was it complacency? He said, I don't think complacency is the right word, but so I think.
Yeah, I think they were got there. You see,
Sure.
there's a bit of a pattern here. If you look at the Heineken Cup final as well, like everybody knows that if you let Leinster play the game they want to play, you know, the run and gun game, the spots out the back, the multiple carriers, the tip on passes, and you let them do that, like it's going to be a long day at the office. So that's, and what you do if you look at it, if I'm plotting Leinster's downfall tomorrow, like the first thing I go after is I slow the game down, I attack the ruck relentlessly, I just, you know, upset their tempo, and that's what you saw last weekend again. Shell did it, hung in there. The Bulls upset their tempo. Like Fiona's right. Like the amount of turnovers Leinster had was appalling. Like I mean, they had 16. I went through the game again, you know, minute by minute. 16 turnovers, 8 in each half. They had 10 knock-ons and 6 balls lost in contact. The first ball they lost in contact is Robbie Henshaw got stripped 1 meter from the Bulls goal line in the first 2 minutes, and that set the tone for the day. So the problem here for Leinster is I think it goes back to the point you just made. They get it so easy during the season. Like they just cruise through games. They rack up points on teams, and they basically run the bench when it's kind of sunshine rugby time. So there's 2 problems to that. One is when the bench come on, they're just playing like demonstration rugby, just like a training session. When you come off the bench in a game where you're behind, it's a different ball game altogether. So the bench aren't used to coming on and trying to change a game. They're usually coming on to put the cherry on the cake.
How do you fix that? Because it sounds like something that is very, very difficult to fix.
Well, the problem they have is some of it's out of their control because they're so good in the URC. They're so good in the URC that you can't blame them for beating teams by 40 points. They're good enough. But I think where they take control is they have got to identify that when you get into knockout rugby, it's not the same thing. When there's no bonus point at the end of the day, why are you turning down kicks in front of the post? Like, there's a different headset. It's knockout rugby. Stay, even if things are going badly, make it a 1-score game. That's what Lara Shell did. Lara Shell were drowning at times in the final against Leinster. They were down to 14 men. They just hung on and hung on and hung on. They made it a 1-score game in the last 10 minutes, and they got a break and they won the game. Like Leinster were 2 scores down, and they had multiple chances to make it a 1-score game by kicking a penalty, and they put it into the corner and lost the lineouts. And they couldn't make it a 1-score game until it was too late. So I think that's knockout rugby, and they've got to make that adjustment. Plus the fact, when you're Leinster, you're the favourite. What's the other team going to do? They're going to come in and rattle your cage. Now, I'm not talking about they're going to punch you in the face. That's not going to happen anymore. That's one way of rattling someone's cage. In the old days, the Munster Cup match, you retaliated first back in the 80s, in a Munster Senior Cup match, fine, you retaliate first. But, in these games, you've got to do is, what are they going to do? Well, Leinster had to expect them to attack the ruck, bring physicality at the breakdown, try and break their tempo. And, Jake White said it after the game all week. They talk about slowing Leinster down, attacking the ruck. So Leinster go out and they run the same attacking pattern they run against the Dragons, or they run that's successful against the Scarlets, or successful against Edinburgh. And they go, what could go wrong here? Well, lots of things can go wrong when the ruck ball is a 5-second ruck instead of a 2-second ruck. And they probably needed to recalibrate what they were doing. Maybe some different plays, maybe more resources to the ruck, put more people into the ruck, not expect to get the ball as easily with a 2-man clean out. They might need a 3-man clean out. And they got caught again. And no, that's the first thing, everyone has a plan to get punched in the mouth. But no, they had a chance to recalibrate during the game. They didn't recalibrate during the game either. So they got caught, I think, a bit cold, that this is knockout rugby and guys are going to come after you and try and eat your lunch. And then if it does go wrong, what are we going to do about it? And the same happened in the Heineken Cup final. They went out with a plan. It's worked all season. It didn't work. They have to adjust. So I think they need to recalibrate what they're doing around knockout rugby. That's the key. Because it's a different ball game. And we talk about Ulster as well. Ulster made a couple of strategic errors like that as well, in not accepting it was a knockout rugby match. So I think, for me, I understand why they put the ball to the corner, Leinster, instead of kicking the points. But the point was they were 2 scores down. They should have made it 1 score down, I think. And there was no bonus point by getting 4 tries. It wasn't going to save you.
But just on that part, Eddie, so I'll let you in a second, Fiona. Just on that point, like was part of the criticism after the La Rochelle game was that they started playing 3-6-9-12 rugby rather than backing themselves and going for those scores?
No, because I wouldn't agree with that, because against La Rochelle, they were smarter in terms of staying of trying to edge away from La Rochelle. They played a bit more like hub rugby, but tactically in La Rochelle they got caught. They recognised it after a while against La Rochelle.
I'm just here like you wouldn't have an issue with that La Rochelle game that they were chipping over the points.
No, I think they were doing the right thing. It was a final.
Yeah,
it was a final. But I think where they got caught was that they need to have, since White could have not played their game because La Rochelle were killing them at the breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to address the breakdown there rather than they were smart enough not to force the running game when they weren't getting the dividends. I had no problem with that. But I think last weekend, for some reason, they tried to play their game. And I think there was an element of that if we keep doing this, we're going to win, because it works every week. But it's not every week in a knockout game. And I guess where the Bulls got them, the Bulls got to them physically, got them in there, and Leinster didn't adjust around the intensity of knockout rugby. And like it's now something they have to address, because there is a bit of a pattern emerging on it.
And coming into the last 2-3 minutes of the game, you still have your starting hooker and your starting loosehead on the pitch as well. I mean, that
goes back to the bench, Fiona, doesn't it?
That
they didn't want to run the bench, because usually that bench is running on to put the cherry on the cake.
Yeah, and that's
the same against La Rochelle as well. They were reluctant to use the subs.
And I understand. And sometimes you understand that if there's a guy coming on capped. I mean, but you'd Keane Healy and you had Cronin on the bench, who are well capable of finishing out a game for you and could offer a lot more physicality. Like the guys that, I mean, Dan Sheehan, maybe a couple of liners went astray, but he was absolutely everywhere in the pitch. He was like, he threw his body.
And Cronin is a guy who can make a line break. Like, he's lightning quick.
Yep.
That's why he causes mayhem in a lot of games when he comes off the bench and fellas are tired. He skins guys inside and outside.
He's very much the definition of an impact player.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Now,
but anyway, look, there's issues there they have to address. I think when they get into now, they're going to. I think next season is going to be tougher with the Bulls and stuff are going to be up and at it. But I still think Leinster aren't a bad team overnight. They just need to recalibrate when they get to the knockout stage of the season, how they want to deal with those challenges.
We are running out of time. Fiona, Eddie mentioned it there right at the very end that the South African teams are going to be even stronger next season. So based on that, as much as anything else, how big of a missed opportunity has this been for Ulster?
Oh, huge. I mean, I watched that game. It was an exciting game, and I really felt if Ulster could have come through, that they would have really performed at home in a final. How long has it been since they had a final up in Ravenhill? It's been a long time. So look, it was a massive missed opportunity, but that seems to be kind of the story of Ulster this season, isn't it? When it comes down to the crunch games, they're losing out by just like tiny little things. And I know over in South Africa, obviously that try was the allowed that shouldn't stand or whatever, but just even the Toulouse games, it's just tiny little things that are getting in the way of stopping them getting to that final, which they planned for the season. And they played really, really well against the team over in South Africa, but it's a very hard place to go. And I think the Stormers playing backline attack rugby was just absolutely outstanding. I have to take my hats off to them. They're liable to do anything, but they're really, really exciting to watch as well. And even their back row, Evan Roos, was just immense as well.
Yeah, and Eddie, I think that game was a perfect example of the fine margins between success and failure in the game.
Oh yeah, I think there's no doubt that Ulster got Harley George with 2 tries down. They're caught cold, but in fairness, they bounced back brilliantly and they got the ball to the outside channels, and Balakoon was devastating. But the problem in the second half, I don't know why, they were 5 points up. They got a really, really good boost at halftime.
They got the big defensive stop towards just before the break.
They did, and the Stormers tried a drop goal for some strange reason. Then they gave away 2 penalties in a row, and suddenly Cooney taps one over and they're in the break. It's all good at the moment. And they come out in the second half and they just squandered. You see, they were behind on the possession and the territory stats. I mean, they had very little territory. They had less than 40% territory. So in the second half, they had very few sorties into the Stormers half. And the ones they got, they threw them away. They kicked the ball away so many times in the second half. They made a fantastic line break from did a fantastic line break at one stage. I think it was Klusky early in the second half. And
it was a turnover, and John Cooney put a kick down, and they chased and got one line out.
It was a line break that McCluskey made from deep.
Yeah.
In about the 50th minute. And it was a 50-meter line break, and he fed the ball inside to Billy Burns, who gave it inside to Cooney. And for some strange reason, Cooney kicked the ball into the corner. And it looked like, there's a line out for us, but they lost the line out. I mean, he just held on to the ball. The Stormers were all over the place defensively. Now, it's a 5-point game. So, let's make it a 2-score game. Even if we get a penalty here. And then they went to the corner. I hate saying this because, again, you're saying, you're playing Monday morning quarterback. But at that point, they were a 5-point lead. They had a penalty that would have made it an 8-point game. And Cooney was kicking really well. He would have nailed it, I think, 9 times out of 10. They went to the corner and they got a bit of white line fever and they turned the ball over. So that was a chance to make it a two-score game. And then even when they were against 14 men at the end, they threw a loose pass on the ground and they recovered it and they kicked the ball away. That was the 73rd minute. They never got the ball back really in the Stormers half. The last 15 minutes was played in around the Ulster 22 and eventually the dam burst. So I think when Ulster had it back, they would have backed themselves a little bit more. I mean, Stuart Moore kicked the ball open the full early in the second half in an attacking position. They probably go, we're 5 points up here. And they might have realised, if we win here, there's a final in Ravenhill next week. Having Leinster last night before. So they got ahead and it was a low scoring game. They had very little possession and territory. They probably, when they got into those attack positions, need to back themselves more and hang on to the ball. But for some reason, they kind of let's stay out of our half and kick the ball away. And the recipe for them was to get the ball into the outside channels. I saw the damage they did in the second half of Ballacoon. So I think if they had it back, they would have probably backed themselves more a bit. And they had a penchant for giving away scores in the last 10 or 15 minutes of games. That's been kind of an Achilles heel all season. So I think there'll be huge remorse for being in a position to win the game. And again, if they gave up that try with 5 minutes to go, but giving it up in the 85th minute, or the 86th minute is shocking hard to take. But I think, they'll regret this because they were in a position where they could have won the game, and for some reason they didn't quite back themselves to keep the ball in hand. I think if they had it back, they probably held the ball a lot more,
The final thoughts very quickly. Who would you be backing this Saturday in the final, Stormers or Bulls?
I'd be going with the Bulls, Neil, but it's going to be a sad day. There's no one going to be drinking out any trophies. So, I mean, what's this new trophy about?
You can. Apparently that little thing opens up in the little whatever. I don't even know what to call that kind of.
Okay. I take it back. So
apparently, I did look into this. Apparently, you can take the lid off, and there's part of it that you can fill up and have your.
Fair enough.
After the match, Eddie, who do you think is going to win this weekend?
I think the Bulls, because they have an out half. It's cup rugby. They have an out half. I mean, the Stormers don't have an out half. I mean, so I think that's going to be a major factor. No, it's a final, who knows? But I think if you had to put your family silver on, I think the Bulls are probably going to take it home.
All right. 2 predictions for the Bulls. Anyway, that game is 6:30 this Saturday evening. Live on RT2 and RT Player as well. That's it for the RTÉ Rugby podcast this week. Thanks again to Eddie and Fiona, and we'll speak to you all again soon.
The RTÉ Rugby podcast, sponsored by Canterbury. See the new Irish men and women's rugby jerseys at canterbury.com.